let's get started. Next slide, please. So thanks everyone. In parallel to the climate summit that is going on, that many of you will be following, we now recognize that climate change is real and we need to act fast and urgently on it. In terms of the cotton, there is increasing evidence that's coming in that cotton sector as a whole is going to be impacted greatly by climate change, by several risks such as extreme rainfall, drought, and wildfires. And farmers and producers are going to be in direct line and will be directly exposed to these risks disproportionately, also because they have limited adaptive capacity and greater sensitivity to deal with these impacts. But we also need to recognize that every part of the cotton value chain is going to be impacted because of these risks, including brands, financial actors, and everyone else in the value chain. So what this requires is a coordinated and a collaborative action on adaptation to climate change impacts as well as on mitigation. So that is the premise based on which the Cotton 2040 initiative is based, and that's why we've gathered here today. Next slide, please. So just before we dive into today's agenda, I quickly wanted to introduce Forum for the Future in case some of you don't know us well. So we are an international sustainability not-profit. We've been working for more than 25 years now with businesses, governments, and civil society organizations to basically accelerate transformation to a just and regenerative future. And we do that by leveraging our expertise in systems change and futures to accelerate some of the global challenges. And supply chain is one such challenge that we work on. We also help cultivate capacity of organizations and individuals to bring long-term and transformational change. One, for example, is what is required in the cotton value chain. Next slide. It's my also great pleasure to introduce our technical partners in this initiative, Willis Towers Watson, formerly, as I said, known as Acclimatize. So Willis Towers Watson are a global advisory, broking, and solutions company with more than 45,000 employees, and they help their clients turn risk into a path of growth. Part of Willis Towers Watson, whom we have been engaging and are the major partner in this initiative, are the Climate and Resilience Hub. They are a leading center on climate adaptation, and they are supported by a wide network called Willis Research Network. That's network of science, academia, think tanks that help in quantification and understanding of the climate risk and how do you build resilience in society and in their clients. So it's a great pleasure to have them partnering with us, and you will hear from Alistair and Erin from Willis Towers Watson in a short while. So let me hand over to my co-host, Charlene, to introduce you to the Cotton 2040 initiative.
Thank you, Dhaval, and welcome everyone. It's great to see some of our partners on the call and many new voices in the room. This conversation has been years in the making over the years of Cotton 2040's work. And so it's a delight to be able to kick off this conversation today. For those of you that might not be familiar with Cotton 2040, we're a multi-stakeholder collaborative initiative that was set up some years ago to work across the cotton sector and with the sustainable standards and other organizations that are driving change in cotton to create collaborative change on those areas that really are critical for the future of the industry. And our aims are to work for a cotton sector that is resilient and adapting to an increasingly changing climate, that uses business models that are sustainable and where sustainably produced cotton is just the norm. It's just the way things are done. And we are hosting 2 roundtables today. This is the first. We have another one this afternoon in a different time zone. And these are critical conversations to prepare the industry for a very different kind of future that is not so far on the horizon. If we can show the next slide, please. Just like to share those partners who have been working with us on this phase of Cotton 2040. As you see, we partner with the range of sustainable cotton standards and supporting organizations, brands, retailers, other NGOs and other actors across the sector. And we are always keen to grow that partnership. So any of you on the call today are welcome to contact us and find out about getting involved in Cotton 2040's work. So I will hand back to Dhaval to take us into the specifics of cotton and climate change. Dhaval, over to you.
Thank you so much, Charlene. So as I said, cotton is going to be increasingly exposed to climate risks, particularly rising temperatures, water availability, extreme weather events, and will need to adapt very quickly, very radically. At the same time, it's also contributing to climate change. So mitigation is also something that the sector will have to think about increasingly. So in all, what we are seeing is a very climate disrupted world, and the sector will have to change radically to survive and thrive in such a future. So as part of supporting that radical transformation that's needed, as Charlene said, we, along with our partner, are convening different people, different organizations, and we've published 2 analyses earlier this year. So the first one is a global analysis, and it's the first of its kind that has never been done before. So it's an analysis that looks at what are the risks that cotton growing regions are projected until 2040. It includes sensitivities that are very specific to cotton. So if any of you who have not looked at the analysis, I highly encourage you to look at that report. Erin and Alistair are also going to give us an overview of the findings, as well as demonstrate the tool that houses all these findings later today. So look forward to that. Apart from that, we also recognize that exposure to risks is complemented by the sensitivity and the adaptive capacity to 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 sort of to lead to vulnerability that will affect the cotton growing regions. So we've also done that sort of an analysis for India that, again, I would encourage people to look at, just to understand how the vulnerability stems from some of the climate risks that are projected. And while that analysis is for India, a similar kind of framework would be used for other regions as well. So the idea behind these set of 3 roundtables that we are now going to host is, we've done these analysis. We want to dive deeper into what these data mean for different value chain actors. So we understand the data, we understand the implications of the data through these 3 workshops. And I would highly encourage that people who have joined us today join all 3 roundtables, because we'll be building on whatever we discuss in the earlier roundtables. So in the first roundtable, we will start with what is the data showing us and what are the implications of that for future production. Then in the second roundtable, we'll think about, based on these risks and the implications, what are the kind of adaptive responses that will be required across the value chain for increasing resilience. And then in the third roundtable, we'll think about what are the ways we all could come together to address some of those adaptation responses that are required to build resilience. So those are the 3 roundtables and the structure of it. If we could move to the next slide, please. I'll quickly share the focus for today and today's roundtable. So we want a deliberation on firstly showing what we've found in the analysis, and then have a discussion on what does this mean for different regions globally, as well as specifically in some regions, which are important cotton growing regions. We also want deliberation on what are the kind of implications, both environmental and social, of these projected risks, not just for farmers and producers, but also across the value chain. And then hopefully start thinking about how do we come together and build a collaborative response to these risks and the responses that are required. Next, please. So in terms of the agenda for today, once we've done with the introduction, we want to share and start with sharing some of the stories and experiences from the field in terms of how climate change is already impacting at the ground level. Then we will have Alistair and Erin talk about the global analysis that I mentioned, uh, and do a demo of the tool that houses this analysis. Then we will break out into groups based on the risks that we have. We've just been highlighted for different regions. What does this mean for different actors? So we'll be breaking out in different groups based on our role, and then we'll come back and share what we've found, not just for sort of our actors, but also across broader systems. And then we'll close today's roundtable, hopefully with that insight of what's the impact likely to be and what are the implications of that climate impact. Next slide, please. So before we jump into the experiences and stories from the field, we quickly wanted to get a pulse of where in our journeys all of us are. So this is a Menti poll. You can open the link that's just been posted in chat, or you could also open menti.com and enter this code, or you could also scan your QR code. It's a simple single question on how is your organization currently planning for climate adaptation, just to get a pulse of where we all are. So maybe take half a minute, and you'll see as the responses come in terms of where we are in our journey.
Interesting, Daval, to see the
Very.
real-time data coming in.
Absolutely, Charlene. And so encouraging to know that majority of us are already planning or are implementing responses around climate adaptation. So that's great to see. Okay, I guess we've heard from few people are still to respond. Please do respond to that Menti poll, and we will keep that data. That's a great insight for us as we go towards further roundtables. So okay, so before we dive into the data and the more technical parts of it, we wanted to take a moment to listen to what farmers and producers are already experiencing, and we wanted to sort of pause for a moment just to recognize that this is not an exercise or a discussion just for its own sake. This is a reality that millions of farmers are already experiencing. This is not something that will affect them in future, but they're already experiencing these challenges. So let's be mindful of the kinds of risks that they face as we go through this roundtable and all the other roundtables, and think about how our actions can help build the adaptive capacity and the resilience of the entire value chain, including the farmers and the producers that are fundamental to this value chain. So I wanted to spend a couple of minutes, about 10 minutes, on this one, and I wanted to invite invite anyone who is particularly working with farmers or working at the ground level to share some of their experiences of how climate is already impacting them. And I can't see everyone, but yeah, pop it when it's hot. Anyone who wants to go, please unmute and share your experiences.
So Dhaval, just to be clear, you're inviting people to speak up now and volunteer.
Yeah.
All right. So not wanting to put folks on the spot, but anybody who has some insights into what farmers are experiencing on the ground, this is a space where you can just step in and speak up for a minute or two.
Yeah, I can just start, Dhaval.
Yeah, please.
Promit here. Yeah, and thanks, Dhaval, and to your team and everybody here. I mean, Dr. Prasad, Dr. Renu, Selina, and others. We've had a chance to, speak about this with almost a lot of people who are present here today. But I think just to summarize what our experience and engagement with, farmers in Maharashtra has been that the uncertainties of climate is becoming more and more. Plus, I think if you look at how climatic conditions should be in relation to the growth and phenology of the crop, it's, the recent trends show that they are exactly opposite to what the plant needs. So, our analysis of breaking the entire cotton stage into, crop cycle into various stages and doing analysis of both historical and future projections have indicated that there is a little mismatch between what the plant actually needs at that time, whether it is, from sowing to the square formation, the square formation ball and others. So at every stage, there are these risks. And the only other point that I would like to add is that the vulnerability of this, there is differential. So, it is impacting a small versus large, a margin, irrigated versus rain-fed, a men versus women differently. So, I mean, just around, just these 2 points around how the impact is at times just opposite to what the plant needs, and secondly, in relation to the differential vulnerability that different groups of farmers have.
That's so insightful, Romit. Thanks for sharing that. We have time for a couple more people if anyone feels like sharing their experiences from the ground. It's really helpful for everyone to hear that.
I'm from Better Cotton Initiative in India,
Yeah.
and I would just like to mention one thing I just heard from one of our partners in Telangana, that's south of India, yesterday, that September and October, there was so much rain that they had to uproot all the cotton and now shift to another crop. This is the kind of vulnerabilities we are seeing in the field. I mean, I just wanted to mention that this is like so fresh in the memory because I just heard it yesterday from one of our major partners. So this is, for the last 2 seasons, this has been the case in Telangana. They tend to the crop for 3 months, 4 months, and then they just have to uproot it.
Yeah, that's true. Thanks for sharing that, Salim. Appreciate it. Okay. Does anyone else feel like this is something really important that they want to share, or else we'll move forward?
Yeah, I'm Dr. Prasad.
Yeah, please, Dr. Prasad.
See, in this part of the cotton growing zone, especially in the central and southern zones of in India, more due to rainfall variability is increasing and extreme events are increasing. These two concerns are really, and associated losses due to issues in retention of bolls and then emergence of especially diseases like boll rot and all. These are all aggravated due to the increased variability that we are experiencing. And any analysis also points to the significant role in terms of extreme events. That is the major concern for us. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. So helpful, and yeah, several things that we have read that comes from CICR point to that. So thanks for sharing that, Dr. Prasad.
If you'd like, I'm Alexandra Pershaw. I work for CottonMed in Africa, so I can report from a different continent.
That would be lovely.
We work with partners in 10 different countries, so West Central Africa, Eastern Africa, Southern Africa, and I can just confirm what the other participants have reported. So we're working only with smallholder farmers, only in rain-fed conditions, and everyone is struggling with either late rains, flooding in between, or droughts. And all those conditions leading also to increased pest pressure at certain times, or just a question if you have planted early and then there's another heavy rain coming, you have to do the replanting. So it's a lot of cost constraints also adding to those uncertainties, and the risk is getting higher and higher for the farmers. So it's pretty much very similar to what you experience in India.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. That's lovely. And I forgot to mention, we have people from not just from India, but Australia, Africa. So yeah, would be great to hear other insights if anyone has.
Me, Lal Khan Babar from Cotton Connect, Pakistan. I would like to share. We are working with implementing partners. There is uncertainty in weather conditions. That is sudden rise in temperature and not timely rains, unexpected rains, and that affects the plants, pollination, plants fruiting. It affects all.
Yeah, thank you so much. So similar experiences, but great to hear that that's the experience across different regions. So thank you so much, Dr. Okay, just mindful of the time, and we have a short video that we want to show. But thank you everyone who shared their experiences in terms of how some of these impacts are being felt by farmers themselves. Yeah, so I spoke to one of the farmers in Gujarat recently, and hopefully it's a similar experience, but you will find that interesting. I want to share some in turn as well. They've been very helpful to help us talk to some of these farmers. So the next, what you'll see is a short video of one of the interviews that we did with a farmer in Gujarat, sharing some of his concerns around variability in climate.
પ્રવીણભાઈ નાગજીભાઈ સરવૈયા, મારું ગામ ધજાળા, તાલુકો સાયલા અને જિલ્લો સુરેન્દ્રનગર. 3 એકરથી વધુનું છે, 8 વીઘા જેવું છે. હા, અમારે આ સૂકો વિસ્તાર ને એટલે મેઇન પાક અમારે કપાસ છે. કપાસ ઓર્ગેનિક છે અને વિદેશ વાળા રહે છે. અચ્છા, વિદેશ વાળા એટલે કયા? વર્ષોથી સાહેબ ખેતી જ કરતા આવે છે, બાપ દાદા વખતથી, પણ 14 વર્ષથી લગભગ હું સુમિંતરા જોડાયેલો. અચ્છા અચ્છા. વર્ષે એમ માનો ને કે 140 મણ જેવો થઈ રહ્યો, 140-45. 140 વર્ષ નબળું હોય અને ઓછા પિયત મળ્યા હોય તો ના, 1-2 વર્ષમાં બહુ સારું છે. સરસ છે. ઓકે. અમારે શરૂઆતમાં જોઈન્ટ થયા ને ત્યારે અમારે વીઘા દીઠ મણ ઓછા થતા, પછી જેમ જેમ જમીનમાં સુધારો થતો ગયો ને, રાસાયણિક ખાતર માનો વાપરતા ને જમીન કડક થઈ જતી, ખારી થઈ જતી, એ બધું અમારે સિમ્પલ થઈ ગયું. એ બધું અમે આમાં દાટવા માંડ્યા. ત્યાર પછી જમીનમાં સુધારો થયો, અળસિયા વધ્યા. અચ્છા. દવાઈ વાપરતા બંધ થઈ ગયા. અનિયમિતતા છે ને સાહેબ, એના હિસાબે થોડોક ઓલું રે, માર રે. પાણીની જરૂરિયાત હોય ત્યારે વરસાદ ન આવે, પછી જયારે વરસાદ આવે ત્યારે એક આમ તો પુષ્કળ પડી જાય. એમ એટલે કપાસ બગડી જાય પછી એનો સુધારો થાય તો આપણે મહિના ગાળાનો ટાઈમ લાગી જાય અથવા તો કપાસ બળી જાય એવું બને.
બરાબર. એટલે વધારે તડકો પડે એના લીધે?
હા, વધારે તડકો પડે કે વધુ વરસાદ પડે એટલે કપા બળવા માંડે. જે વરસાદનો માવઠાનો રાઉન્ડ ની આગાહી હતી એમાં જો વરસાદ આવ્યો હોત તો આપણે તૈયાર કપા નષ્ટ થઈ જાય ને, ક્વોલિટી નબળી પડી જાય એટલે આપણે પછી નીચા ભાવમાં વેચવો પડે.
સમસ્યાઓ
અત્યારે અમારે મેઇન સમસ્યામાં જે પાછલા સમયમાં લાલ ઈયળ લાગે ને, ઝીંડવાની ઈયળ, એ મોટી મુશ્કેલી સાહેબ. છેલ્લા 3 વર્ષથી જ વધે છે. છેલ્લા 3 વર્ષ. સુમિંતરા જોઈન્ટ થયા પછી કોઈ તકલીફ નહીં સાહેબ. ભાવમાં કે વેચવામાં એકેય જાતની તકલીફ નહીં.
અચ્છા, સરસ.
બાકી જો વરસાદ મોડો થાય અમારા આ વિસ્તારમાં, અમે કાયમ બધાથી પાછળ જ હોય, સૂકો વિસ્તાર હાવ, તો એ અમારે ઉગાડવામાં થોડીક તકલીફ થાય. શું ત્યારે અમારે કુવામાં પાણી ન હોય.
અચ્છા.
વરસાદ આધારિત વધારે.
બરાબર, બરાબર. ત્યાં આપણે નહેરનું પાણી કે એવું કઈ નથી આવતું?
ના, એવું કોઈ નહીં. અત્યારે જોડાણ્યા પછી અમને ભાવે સારા મળી રહેશે. પછી સુમિંતર વાળા જે અમને મદદ કરે, ટૂંકમાં નાની અમારી છોકરીઓ ભણતી હોય એને શિષ્યવૃત્તિ આપે છે. બીજા સામાજિક કામમાં મદદ કરે છે. માનો કે અમારા ગામમાં પાણીની તકલીફ હોય તો અવાડા બનાવે.
બરાબર.
ખેડૂતોને આંતરખેડ માટે નાના રોટાવેટર આપે.
બરાબર.
એ બધી મદદ કરે એ અમારા માટે ફાયદો જ છે સાહેબ.
બરાબર.
અમારે જયારે ઉગાવાની તકલીફ હોય ને સાહેબ ત્યારે પાણી એકદમ ઓછું હોય, 15-20 મિનિટના પાણી હોય. પણ જો આવી કંપનીઓ અમને શું કહેવાય ટપક ને એવી બધી મદદરૂપ થાય ને તો એ શરૂઆતમાં અમને બહુ મજા આવે.
બરાબર.
કારણ કે અમારે જો વરસાદ ન થાય તો જુલાઈ મહિનો આખો કાઢવો પડે.
અચ્છા.
ઈ ગાળામાં અમારી પાસે માનો 15 મિનિટનું પાણી હોય અને જુલાઈના એન્ડમાં તે 15 મિનિટના પાણીથી ને અમે ટપક હોય તો કપાસ ઉગાડીએ.
Great.
સાહેબ,
So hopefully that.
સાહેબ પ્રવીણભાઈ.
Thank you, Neil. Okay, so hopefully that's given you a sense, and again, all thank you for sharing everyone the experiences. So I will now hand over to our partners, Hemisphere and Erin, who will walk you through the global analysis that we've done. Over to you, Hemisphere and Erin.
Thank you very much. Yes, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So a year and a half ago, we were given the task of mapping the climate change risks to the cotton value chain. And as part of this task, we collaborated with a group of stakeholders, about 30 stakeholders, to explore options, what the industry needed from us, what the industry needed in terms of an analysis, investigation, and at the end of the day, it was agreed that a map of the impact of climate change on the global cotton value chain was needed. And therefore, the global analysis ended up with an interactive web map, which I will show you a presentation of in a minute, and also a report summarizing the key findings. And this is available to be downloaded from the microsite, which I'm sure is it possible for us to maybe drop a link of the microsite into the chat or something for people to explore. So I'll firstly brief you quickly on the methodology for the global analysis, and then I'll show you the latest version of the global map, the interactive map that we have, and then we'll get into the meat of things and into the key messages then for the different regions across Asia. So a little bit about the methodology then. As expected, given Cotton 2040, the analysis centres at the 20-year average climatology around 2040s. As for the emission scenario, which is the projection of the trajectory for how the world will be in terms of global emissions, we decided to go for the RCP 8.5. So this represents the worst case emission scenario. The reason behind this is that understanding the worst case risks is important in the adaptation narrative and when it comes to deciding adaptation actions, but also because the RCP 8.5, the worst case scenario, is the trajectory that the world is currently on. The analysis also looked at a variety of climate hazards, so both the acute and the chronic risks, so extreme weather events, including wildfire, landslides, flooding and so forth, and then also chronic risks, so those gradual incremental changes in temperature, changes in rainfall and so forth. What made this study unique and one of its kind is that these indicators contained thresholds which are specific for cotton as a crop. For example, the heat stress indicator. So this sets a threshold of 40 degrees in terms of a 40 degrees temperature, above which temperatures would be lethal to cotton as a crop. And so these 12 climate hazards were mapped across the global cotton growing regions, and they were scored relative to each other. So the scoring goes from a no risk to a very high risk relative to other cotton growing regions. And this enables us to identify which regions are at the high or very high level of risk for particular hazards. By breaking the analysis down into these 12 hazards, it also enables us to identify what is the main driver of risk at the particular location of interest. Identifying the main driver then allows us to take that second step and identifying the adaptation actions which can be taken. And then that goes into hopefully what we'll be doing as part of the second workshop later on in November, exploring those adaptation options of different types suitable for different hazards. And so, yeah, next slide, I think, please, Neil. This is the latest version of the interactive web map, which we are about to release this global scale, the ability to zoom out into to get a global view in the next couple of hours. And yeah, I think if you press play, it should run. Fantastic. So again, this is available to launch from the microsite. As you can see, you can toggle between the different hazards, the 12 different hazards, which I mentioned before, from the acute risks to the chronic risks. The description of each indicator is in the panel on the right-hand side, and this includes the impact of that hazard on the cotton crop, in addition to the methodology and complete transparency in terms of the data sets used. The legend, as I mentioned, measures risk from no risk to very high risk, and you can toggle around and search for your region of interest by using the search tool, as I showed there, or zooming in and out of the map, of course, and then clicking on the region, and it will show you the risk score. So this is available for you to play around with in your own time to explore the region of interest to you. And yeah, like I said, the global version, so the ability to zoom out, should go live in the next few hours. So yeah, watch this space. So looking then at the key drivers from this analysis, the results then. So I'm not going to go into every single result, but I'm going to pick out the very high risk from the regions across Western and Central Asia, over to Southern Asia, Eastern Asia, and Australasia. Picking out the key hazards and the main drivers for these regions. Sorry, yeah, thank you. So a key trend, as you can see, the Southern Asia and Western and Central Asia have the highest number of hazards at the very high risk category. Looking then at similar trends and so forth, we can draw out that heat-related hazards are very important across the regions. Not only heat stress, but drought, and then of course wildfire as a result of that, with high temperatures in a very dry environment, given that there's adequate amount of fuel available, giving rise to a higher risk of wildfires. I should note as well that the rainfall here means insufficient rainfall. So that is a threshold of 500 millimeters, which the cotton plant needs during the growing season. And therefore, if the total rainfall doesn't exceed or doesn't reach that threshold or exceed that threshold, it flags as very high risk. And therefore, there must be regions across Western and Central Asia, across Southern Asia, Eastern Asia, which don't reach this level of threshold. What else can we pick out? So mixture of both acute and chronic hazards, with the acute hazards being the coastal flooding in Southern Asia, possibly in regions, for example, Bangladesh and Eastern India. And then, so let's look at each region then in a little bit more detail. Now, I appreciate there's a lot to read on the slides, and I will by no means read the entire thing completely. And it might be an option for us to circulate these results with you later on after the workshop, possibly for you to explore in your own time and to translate these into your own context. But I'll pick out the key trends. I'll look at the high and the very high hazards and variables. And as I go through these next 4 slides, ahead of the exercise that we'll be carrying out later on in the workshop, as Deval mentioned, do try and think how these risks and how these hazards would impact you and your stage of the value chain. So do start thinking and playing with ideas ahead of that, of the exercise. So Western and Central Asia, covering regions or countries from Turkey all the way to Azerbaijan and Afghanistan, as well. What can we say then? So we can see that the temperature variables stand out as high risk and very high risk. Across the majority of the region, we are projecting that by the year 2040s, or by the 2040s, under the worst case emission scenarios, that the growing season would shorten in length. This is due to increasing temperatures above that which is optimal for cotton to grow. And this is across the majority of the region in this Western and Central Asia. You can see that heat stress has been picked out as very high here. So that is the number of days when the temperature exceeds the threshold of 40 degrees, above which is lethal for cotton. The impact of which is going to vary according to the different stages of the value chain, of course, but can have a drastic effect on the income of smallholder farmers, especially. As expected then, given increasing temperatures, short-term and long-term droughts are both noted as very high risk across these regions. Shorter-term drought then, about three months, a risk across Western Turkey and Western Tajikistan, with longer-term drought then more of an impact across northern and central Afghanistan, with longer-term droughts impacting the ability of groundwater to replenish, groundwater being essential in some regions to irrigate the cotton. Precipitation then, so total rainfall, and as I mentioned before, this is when not enough rainfall is received, so that 500 millimeter isn't received across the area. So this, in some regions, or across the majority of the growing regions, in Western and Central Asia, we are not seeing the rainfall, total rainfall across the growing season, reaching the minimum threshold required of 500 millimeter. This therefore assumes that hopefully there is sufficient water available in terms of storage, but it's certainly a hazard which is important to note. Interestingly, and I remember picking up on this when the results were first generated, the storms, looking at the storms, so gust or wind speed above 55 miles per hour was particularly very high across Western Turkey and the Mediterranean basin, the eastern end of the Mediterranean basin. And then two other key acute risks, then the landslide risk, very high, particularly in mountainous regions, of course, as expected in Turkey, Syria, northern Iraq, Afghanistan, Tajikistan. And then lastly, wildfires, as I mentioned before, due to the increase in temperature and droughts as well, being very high to high across the majority of the region. So hopefully, yeah, by going through these, you're beginning to think, how would these hazards impact my stage of the value chain? So I think we have 3 more regions to go through. Lovely, thank you. So Eastern Asia, so mainly China and South Korea. Picking out again the high and the very high. As before, very similarly, we're seeing a shortening of the growing season across these regions, particularly across northern China and North Korea. But we are also seeing a high risk of drought, both the short-term drought and the long-term drought across the region. Both then, of course, linked, as I mentioned before, to a higher risk of wildfire. And noting here, very high to high risk across northern and western growing regions in China. Can also pick out that the total rainfall, the risk is very high from not receiving sufficient rainfall, again across this band of cotton growing regions in northern China. And what else can we pick out? The high risk then from the extreme rainfall events, so possibly an increase in the intensity and the frequency of these extreme rainfall events. This, of course, depends when the timing of the extreme rainfall events do happen, especially if it's the case that during the wet season, when you get extreme rainfall on already saturated soils, could cause overland flooding and increase the risk of damage to the crops from flooding and oversaturation. And then extreme rainfall also being a key driver of landslide risk. And you can see here a high risk across southeastern China and the majority cotton growing regions in North Korea, high risk from landslides. And yeah, I think we can go on to the next one, please, Neil. Australasia then, so moving to the southern hemisphere, the south. What can we pick out here? Again, shortening of the growing season, not quite the very high risk as we projected for the other regions, but still high, still important. Drought, the short-term drought, the long-term drought being very high. Again, as I mentioned before, the ability to replenish groundwater, especially across regions north of Sydney. Precipitation, high risk of not receiving sufficient rainfall across the growing season, during the growing season, across southern states of New South Wales. Less risk from strong winds, less risk from extreme rainfall events, but as expected, maybe the high risk from wildfires across Australia, given the high temperature and the high drought predicted. Yes, and I think there should be one more, or is that? Perfect, so Southern Asia, yes, so India, Pakistan, all the way over to Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, and so forth. I think this was the region which was projected to have the highest number of hazards at high or very high risk, so that's an interesting point to mention here. Again, high heat stress, so the number of days when temperature exceed 40 degrees, the lethal threshold was particularly important across Pakistan. That stood out, I remember that. Also, the projected, the length of the growing season across the majority of cotton growing regions in Pakistan is projected to shorten, a higher risk of this happening. And then in terms of the droughts, both the short term and the long term, again, very high risk across northeastern India, in addition to northwestern India, Laos, Myanmar, Thailand, southern Vietnam. Total rainfall, so the risk of not receiving enough rainfall then, this was projected to be very high across regions in southern Pakistan. So not as much a case across the other regions as expected from the monsoon and so forth, but especially across southern Pakistan. And then the extreme rainfall, the very high risk across the entire region of an increase in extreme rainfall events, the frequency, the intensity, and so forth. Strong winds, not as much of an issue compared to other cotton growing regions across the globe, but landslide risk in mountainous regions, central Pakistan, Nepal, Myanmar, particularly very high risk in these regions. And lastly, as expected, very high to high risk of wildfires, given the increase in temperatures across central and southern Pakistan and northwestern India. I'd say on a whole, on a coastal flooding, of course, in Bangladesh and northeastern India. On a whole, there were numerous high risk and to very high to high risk across Pakistan and across some regions in India as well, which are worth noting. In light of time, I will pass on to Alistair then to introduce the exercise.
Great stuff. Okay, thank you everyone. So we've heard from Erin now about some of the climate hazards and the summary that's come out of the work that we've done and the tool, which I encourage you all to have a look at after this call if you haven't already. But now we're going to move into a working session where we're going to be broken up into a series of 4 groups, breakout groups, and they relate to the kind of generally the sector or the area of interest that we think you should, where you essentially lie. So we're going to have 4 breakout groups, one around farm level, one around, second one around processing, manufacturing, the third one around retailing, and then a 4th one around investor and traders. So we're going to break everyone up into those groups. And what we're essentially going to do is we're going to work through an exercise of looking at the various climate hazards. So the climate hazards that we've been looking at are going to sort of lead the conversation. We're going to look at things like what extreme precipitation might mean within, for example, the farm level breakout group, and discuss what extreme precipitation might mean in terms of risks, not just necessarily in terms of the operation of the farm itself, but thinking more broadly, a little bit more systemically. So thinking about, you know, necessary inputs to the farm, thinking about infrastructure that the farm relies on, and how that might in itself be affected by climate change and have a knock-on effect for the farm, etc., etc. So the facilitators will take you through that process of thinking both about the central issues, but also the sort of wider knock-on effects. So we're going to spend about 45 minutes, I believe, on this, and we will go through and actively fill in some sheets, which you'll see in a moment or two. And there's an example at the bottom of this slide. And we've got a scribe who will be taking notes of people's comments, and we really actively encourage you to participate. You know, this will be a rich exercise the more we just speak up. It's kind of like brainstorming. There's no wrong answers here. We just want to really get everyone's perspectives down as much as possible, because ultimately this will feed into the second and ultimately the third round table, where we start to think about what the solutions could be to some of the risks, but also perhaps some opportunities that we do identify as part of this breakout group exercise. Okay, so facilitators all know what to do. So when you've got questions for them, you can ask them directly within the breakout groups. Can I have a time check that we're on for 45 minutes duration, or are we having to adjust that slightly? Because the worst is someone's halfway through their wonderful thing that they're saying and then the breakout group stops. So can we just have a time check, please?
We're good, Alistair.
All right, for 45 minutes. Okay,
and
that's
just
great.
a request to all the facilitators that when they start the breakout groups, just record so that we could record the breakout groups as well.
Yeah. Okay. So any questions, you can ask your facilitators in a moment.
So thanks everyone. Hope you had a great breakout session across different groups. Several things came out in our group, and hopefully it was the same across groups. So now let's just take 15 minutes or so. Let's just go through each group. And if I could ask the facilitator of each of the groups, starting with the farming first, in about 2 to 3 minutes, what your group identified as the biggest risks, and what stood out for you as the most sort of serious implication or consequence of those risks. So if I could start with farming, Erin first.
Sure, thank you, Deval. So I think what stood out for me mainly, and for us as a group, was the impact on the workforce. So I think we often think of the impacts of climate change on the actual cotton crop itself, and while we did identify a lot of the impacts of those hazards on the cotton crop, it was also made aware that the impact on the workforce, on the farmers themselves, is something that we need to tap into a little bit more, not just in terms of the heat, the impact of increasing temperatures, and the impact then on the genders because of different roles within the farming, but in terms of kidney diseases, heat strokes, and so forth, especially combined with high humidity. It was also raised the point that hot wind, so in regions of high and strong winds, that hot temperatures, hot wind, it makes it very difficult for farmers to go to the fields, as simple as that. In addition, then makes it hard to apply pesticides and so forth, and weeding in the fields, and that impacting the production and the yields from the fields. Interesting point which was raised was strong winds impacting then the cross-pollination of GM crops, impacting the certification then for some cotton standards. This was an interesting point that was raised. In addition then to extreme rainfall and the health and safety concerns around the workforce being able to go into the fields due to high level of water and flooding across the cotton fields, and making it difficult again to carry out the weeding process and to apply pesticides that impacting cotton yield and production. So yeah, good variety of stuff was raised and very good discussion that we had.
Wonderful. You have a minute more, Erin, if you want to, otherwise we can go to the next group.
Hannah, I'm not sure. Hannah, did you have anything else that stood out for you, possibly, as the scribe?
I think you covered it pretty well, to be honest. There was a lot of very useful points, but I think I'm still working through them.
Okay, great. Let's go to the next group then, around processing. Charlene, if you could walk us through some of the things that came up.
Yeah, thank you, Deval. There was a lot that came out, so I'll just highlight a few of the key points. Firstly, thinking about temperature and heat stress, the point was made that if cotton gets moist and then it gets very hot, then it significantly impacts the quality. So there's a real risk to the quality of the cotton. If then thinking about a situation of water stress, drought, or wildfire, the point was made that a huge amount of water are used in processing. So freshwater conservation and availability is really important. So a really key adaptation measure would be looking at more efficient use of water. But if there isn't enough water, then that's a very high risk. So there was a bit of, we began to discuss, the potential of the use of recycled water within the processing cycle. But then we're reminding ourselves of, the wider context that if the wider ecosystem is experiencing water stress, then this is also going to be impacting the water quality that's available. And it will be stressing the workforce themselves because they'll also be struggling to have access for water, not just for their work, but for their very lives. A couple of other points that came up around the risk around drought and wildfire. Of course, if there is wildfire and then there's smoke, that's not just impacting the production of cotton and the availability of cotton, but of course that's creating crisis in the area around. It's meaning that it's not safe to drive, the roads are closed, and the whole production process can grind to a halt. Thinking about precipitation, flooding, and landslides, then the high intensity of the rain can impact water quality if processing mills and plants are taking water from surface water sources. If flooding increases, that impacts the quality of cotton, and that could be quite serious if it gets very wet. And then, of course, there's risks to backlogs in cotton processing if the transport infrastructure is impacted. And then finally, with storms, then there's risk of damage to the infrastructure. It may damage the roads where workers can't get to the processing plant, and the plants themselves might be damaged. And then this, with all the other risks, can mean that there's a failure to meet contracts, leads to a reputational risk, a risk of actually, failing to meet the commitments, and then that impacting the whole supply chain. And so just to summarize what stood out for us, after talking about all these, really depressing possibilities, we were just lifting out, well, what seemed to be the most important. And what people mentioned was, one, the risk of people simply moving away, migration, if it's not tenable to live in these areas, if it's very hard hit, and then the consequent disruption to the supply chain. The availability and the quality of water, whether from too much or too little. And the distress of the farmers, the distress of workers, and the mental health of everybody involved. So, this wouldn't just be impacting, any one stage of the supply chain. Everyone would be working under extreme stress, and the obligation that puts on all the actors in the supply chain to provide greater security for the people who are feeling the impacts and most vulnerable.
Thanks, Shalin. So many interesting ideas there. Appreciate sharing all of that. Okay, let's move quickly to retail. Alistair, if I could request you to limit yourself to 2 minutes.
Yeah, that's fine. So I think what's interesting, I mean, from the brand and retailer group, I think one important take home is the fact that the risks that we were discussing actually weren't related directly just to brands and retailers themselves. I mean, there was such a strong interest in understanding the risks that upstream of the supply chain. So in terms of both the manufacturing and at the farm level as well. So I think a lot of the topics that we discussed had a strong overlay, I should imagine, when we look at all the sheets that we've been filling in with the previous two groups that have just described their key risks. But for us, I mean, we did go over many different dimensions. What was interesting as well is, I think, in terms of filling in the sheets, we less identified ones that related to the hazards of precipitation or flooding or water scarcity, as much as thinking that the risks were broader, so they were kind of more systemic. So a bit of a kind of higher level view as well. We did obviously pick up on specific risks, but that something at a higher level was also important. But ultimately, we talked about things particularly around quality, quantity and price of cotton. We discussed around the often, very high levels of volatility around the pricing of cotton and the impact or the implication that climate change has in producing that level of volatility. And we described about examples, again, we heard a little bit about this earlier, about farmers stopping production altogether of cotton and swapping to a different crop altogether, and the implications of that. So I think that was a very strong area around that whole dimension of quality, country, price, etc. So that was an important one. We also, in no particular order here, we talked about kind of legal and policy dimensions as well. And I know Artie described some good examples of how governments were starting to put in place policies that actually were supporting farmers around these particular kind of risks. So we saw this more as an opportunity, actually, to be involved in some of these, the schemes and activities that are happening as a result of policy change, and how that could also be a good entry point, really, for collaboration. And yeah, that word of collaboration, working together, came up a few times. I think that was a very important aspect, and that probably I would say there's probably a large amount of opportunity for much more working together. I think again there was comments around schemes that on the ground tend to be still led by communities and local or national governments working together, but that there were much more opportunities for brands and retailers and others within the value chain to actually become involved in those. So that was a really interesting area. We had a nice piece around kind of climate finance opportunities as well. So we were quite upbeat. There was quite a bit of discussion about opportunities as well as risks in our group, which I thought was really excellent. Yeah, and how, as you probably heard through COP over the last couple of weeks, how can we leverage that 100 billion that's supposed to be dispersed annually globally to combat climate change in terms of adaptation actions? How can that be tapped into as an opportunity for brands and retailers or any other partners to become involved in schemes that really start to build resilience? I think that's a crucial part for me. Looking at my notes, I think that's pretty much everything. Yeah, I think I might stop there. But yeah, it'd be great to look back at the table and what we filled in, and also compare it with the other groups.
Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Alastair. There's so much in those notes that we'll come back to that. So let me go with sharing what we discussed in the last group. So this was of investors and governments together, but our group only had government actors, so we decided to limit to that. So overall, we discussed a lot of issues that would relate to farmers, things at the farm level. But then we across these risks, we also discussed what the changes and the risks might mean for the inputs that they need, in terms of, if, as we see, there are more pests and different kind of pests, the fertilizer and the pesticide companies and the value chain upstream will need to adapt to some of those changes. Again, things around varying quality came up across all the stresses. Very interesting points in terms of insurance as well, as more and more of these risks affect. There's a need for insurance products to be developed in ways that are fair to farmers, and all the things that will be required in terms of high resolution weather data and those sort of things. There's so many things that I find it difficult to summarize, but one of the things that was highlighted was increased precipitation, particularly in India, is a major factor. So we will have to think about sort of the implications for that, and sort of the cascading impact it would have in terms of increased diseases or incidence of pests, the increased fertilizer that will be used, so on and so forth. And lastly, I think, yeah, I mean, all the risks, there were several things. I guess the only last point that I would highlight that came up was, and probably this is something that we will discuss in the next roundtables, is because of these impacts, how is organic or sustainable cotton doing vis-a-vis other forms of it? And probably there isn't a lot of studies that have been done. So maybe one of the pilots that we might look at could think about this, and how do we collaborate across value chains to think about the impacts across different forms of cotton. So that was what came out in our group. But again, there are lots of other things that I've probably not been able to share, but yeah, that's all there in the document. So we will go back and look at it again. But again, yeah, thanks everyone for it. It looks like you all had a great discussion, and thanks to all the facilitators and scribes for making those notes. Really appreciate. So let's just close quickly. I'm aware of the time. So in terms of next steps, then, as we discussed, this is the first roundtable in the set of 3. So the next one, as we said, we will begin from where we are leaving here. Now we have looked at the risks and some of the implications, and now in the next roundtable, we will start thinking about what are the adaptation responses that are required, and some of it came as it looks like in these breakout groups. So that's great. So we'll look at what kind of adaptations are required, or where are the current adaptations falling short. That helps us think about what are the enabling conditions that will be required, and all of that then helps us bring to, okay, what does collaboration really need to look like if we are to increase resilience and help adapt to climate change across the value chain. Next slide, please. So before I thank you all, I want to hand over to Charlene. Charlene, if there's anything in the end you want to share.
Just to thank everybody for participating today, and a couple of reminders. One, do use these resources to understand the climate risks to your organization. They're free of charge download. We've developed them to be used by the industry, and so we hope you use them. Please do join us over the coming 4 weeks for the additional 2 roundtables that will take this journey further to thinking about what specifically are the priorities for adaptation and where could there be more collaborative efforts to work together. So an outcome that we're aiming to reach through this process is to identify pilots to work on, and we look forward to taking part in that with you. And please do join us in Cotton 2040. You can get in touch with us with the details that have been supplied, and we'd like to continue working with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlene. So thanks, everyone. It's been a wonderful session. I really enjoyed, and hope you all found it useful as well. Just to help us design the next workshops more effective and to be really helpful, please do take 5 minutes if you can to fill out a short survey. That will really help us design the next workshops effectively. Thank you again, everyone. It's been great, and we all look forward to seeing you for the next roundtable on November 30th. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
See you all soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Very much.
Thank you. Bye.